Welcome everyone. We are really pleased to have this session today. We understand that you would like to have some basics, some introduction on medical device regulations that allow you to be really prepared for attending this Congress in San Diego. We have focused like about 85% on European medical device regulations because this is the specialty here in Asphalion concerning medical devices, but we also work with medical device projects that involve United States or FDA in particular. So we have also made sure that there was some content to cover medical device regulations in the United States as well. But the focus, the main part, will be on medical device regulations in Europe, even though general concepts apply basically globally, so that at the end of the session, you should feel comfortable in conversations that involve medical device regulations in general. So basically, this is the foreword. And I would like to introduce myself. I am Dominique Monferret. I am leading the medical device team, working with medical device projects here in Asphalion, but there are other teams working in medical device projects as well, because this is a growing sector. The industry is becoming more and more interested in medical devices in general, and so we are growing steadily to cover all these kind of projects. And in particular, today with me, there is a member of the team, Rainer Rote.
Hello.
And also David Temporal from the commercial team.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure.
And I'm sure you will at least have the opportunity to interact with David for any collaboration that involves both companies. And so let's start with the presentation outline. We will review what is the meaning of the CE marking, in particular for medical devices. We have to have some words on the legal framework. You need to understand what are the currently applicable directives and regulations. We are now in a quite interesting transitional period, so it's important that you have some basics on this as well. And we would like to convey some key aspects and terminology for you to become familiar with these concepts and are able to have discussions with potential customers, both in Europe and in the United States. We will then review that medical devices can be of very different technological types, you probably already know, but this is quite important because this might be linked to their classification in terms of risk class, and it also have consequences in terms of CE marking procedures. And at last, we will review what role do standards and guidelines play in medical device regulations. And then we will switch to a short introduction on medical device regulations in the United States, so that you become familiar with the legal framework in this region for medical devices, the differences in terms of classification system with regards to the European system, what are the main FDA procedures for commercializing medical devices in the United States, and a quick overview on requirements. So let's start. A short quiz. This is just for you to think what these three images could have in common. Because there's no instruction, I will go ahead. These two pictures representing pills or drugs for short and a catheter have in common that they have a medical purpose. Whereas a catheter and this toy have in common that they are both CE marked, but in the middle, we have medical devices, and they have particularities which we need to understand. So the CE marking, what it means, CE marking is this symbol here. You can see it and find it on medical device packaging and labels, either alone or next to a number, for a digits number that identifies the notified body, which is a third party either private or public company or legal entity that is involved in the certification of certain medical devices. So you will see the symbol either in this form or in this other form. And what it means, the device can be marketed not only in Europe, but in the whole EFTA region. This is what it means, because the device is assumed to be conforming with some safety and performance requirements. This is what it means. And therefore, it can be commercialized in all these countries, because all these countries either share the same legal framework or have mutual agreements. The legal framework for medical devices in Europe was until 2017 governed by these 3 directives. We had the General Directive for Medical Devices, a specific directive for active implantable medical devices, and another specific directive for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. This changed in May 2017 by the publication of 2 regulations that will become fully applicable at 2 different dates. Next May 2020, the medical device regulation that is fusing these 2 directives will become fully applicable, and therefore will displace these 2 directives that will no longer apply. 2 years later, in May 2022, the regulation for in vitro diagnostics will replace the corresponding directive. The differences between directives and regulations, if you don't know, is that directives need to be implemented in the legislation of each member state. So they are somehow subject to interpretation and cannot guarantee absolute harmonization, whereas regulations are directly implemented and therefore allow for a much higher degree of harmonization. The transitional period have the dates that you can see on this picture. As we were just commenting, there are 2 key dates, May 2020 and May 2022, where the 2 regulations will become fully applicable. Of course, this means that the industry is now intensively working in becoming adapted, in recertifying, in conducting gap analysis of their current technical documentations to guarantee that their products can still be compliant after these 2 critical dates. It's, of course, much more intense and critical for medical devices than for in vitro diagnostics, because there are 2 more years ahead, and therefore the IVD industry has some additional time to become prepared. This is why medical device projects are so intensively that involve a lot of resources from the industry at this moment in time in Europe. The purposes of this change, of this legal change, were, as we were just commenting, to guarantee a greater degree of harmonization, but also to set higher standards for quality and safety of medical devices. And therefore, the regulations, both MDR and IVDR, as we refer to them for short, put a lot of emphasis on safety and performance requirements, whereby we have an expanded list of requirements than we had under the directives regime. There are increased requirements for device design, safety, and performance characteristics. There is a lot of emphasis throughout the text put on quality management system for medical device manufacturers, which needs to be based on standard ISO 13485. Also, on risk management system for medical device manufacturers, which needs to be based on this other overarching standard, ISO 14971. Also, clinical evidence and post-market surveillance are greatly emphasized by means of increased requirements. Also, traceability and transparency are a great point of emphasis by means of the unique device identification system and the UDMED database that will become implemented, well, some time after the date of full application of MDR. So unique device identification system and UDMED are currently not implemented because the European Commission needs to provide additional specifications for both systems, for both aspects. And we expect that these two points of the regulations will become implemented sometime after May 2020, foreseeably from May 2022. There are also additional responsibilities for all economic operators, not only including manufacturers, but also importers, authorized representatives, distributors, etc. Other aspects that are challenging of these new regulations are that the IVDR sets a new IVD classification system. Other aspects are that, for instance, the notified bodies involved in CE certification of certain medical devices will apply a stricter criteria for CE certification because they are themselves subject to stricter oversight, and actually notified bodies are currently undergoing their own redesignation process to be able to continue CE certifying medical devices under the regulations. And there will also be improved coordination between all EU member states. Some comparison between terms and concepts in medicinal products and medical devices. The marketing authorization holder for medicinal products would be the manufacturer in medical devices, meaning that the manufacturer is the legal entity which is responsible for the CE marking of a medical device, not necessarily who produces the medical device. So manufacturers can have all their manufacturing process totally subcontracted to third parties. And they are still manufacturers and actually identified as such in the instructions for use and labeling. The indication for medicinal products corresponds to the intended purpose or intended use in terms of medical devices. Authorization of medicinal products would correspond to the CE certification of medical devices in Europe or to the FDA registration or clearance of the medical devices in the United States. ICH guidelines for medicinal products correspond to either MedDev guidances, which are those guidances published by the European Commission, the GHDF guidances, which are international, or FDA guidelines. These are the three main organisms publishing relevant guidances for medical devices. Good manufacturing practices would correspond to this standard for quality management system, ISO 13485, or to the quality system regulations in US terms. The competent authority for medicinal products, we also find competent authorities in medical device regulations, but the most relevant part being involved in the CE certification, at least in Europe, is the notified body. That, as we just referred, can either be private or public, most typically private. And the clinical study in medicinal products corresponds to the clinical investigation in medical devices. So as you can see, for some concepts we have different terms, and it might be important to express ourselves in the right term, just not to confuse our audience. In terms of medical devices, we have many different types. You can see some images here of the most typical cases. Well, you can see a syringe, a plaster, surgical equipment, medical imaging equipment, prosthetic devices, catheters, as we said, so vascular devices, and also kits that you can find in a box, including reagents. So as you can see, technologically speaking, they are very different, but these are the most typical cases, and we could have many other cases, but no one has any doubt with regards to that these products here are medical devices. Other cases that present some particularities are, for instance, drug device combinations like this prefilled syringe or this inhaler that are actually regulated under medicinal products legal framework because they include a medicinal product that is conducting the primary action. Then we have, for instance, plasters that this image represents have some silver coating. And silver has antimicrobial properties and therefore has also some particularities in terms of classification, even though it remains a medical device. Companion diagnostics are also particular cases for in vitro diagnostics. We have the so-called substance-based medical devices like this cream formulation here that needs to be topically applied, and that would eventually seem a cosmetic or a medicinal product, but that remains a medical device by virtue of its intended purpose and mechanism of action. And other cases are, for instance, applications or software-based medical devices that are also recently such a hot topic in the industry in terms of development. What is not a medical device, clearly not a medical device, is anything that is a cosmetic, food supplements, biocides or hygiene products, and of course drugs, either chemical drugs or biological drugs. Also considered to be excluded from medical device regulation scope are any viable cell, whatever origin, either plant cells or animal cells or human cells. As long as cells are viable, they cannot constitute any medical device. They cannot be found in a medical device. And at the other end, we find, for instance, general laboratory equipment that has no specific design feature and no specific medical purpose, and therefore also considered to be not medical devices. Exceptional cases are devices that have no medical purpose, but rather aesthetic purpose, and that the new regulation includes in the scope because of their similarities to medical devices and of their related risks. So here you have lipoplasty equipments, dermal fillers, anything that you can see on this image. So let's see, what is a medical device? The definition of medical device in the regulation includes anything, including instrument, apparatus, appliances, software, implant, reagent material, or any other article. So really, a medical device can be anything, as long as it is intended for human use. So this is the European definition. In Europe, medical device can only be applied to humans for any of these purposes, either diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of a disease, injury, or handicap, investigation, replacement, or modification of the anatomy or of a physiological process, or for use in the control of conception. And again, another last aspect of this definition is that this intended purpose cannot be achieved primarily by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. So these three potential mechanisms of action cannot be the principal mode of action of the medical device, even though medical devices can include components that secondarily or auxiliarily act by this means. This is the literal definition that you will find for medical devices in Article 1 of the Medical Device Regulation, where you find the same information. And as we just referred, there is a finite list in Annex 16 of this regulation, where exceptional cases without medical intended purpose are still considered to be included in the scope of medical device regulations. So as we just commented, contact lenses, etc., substances or combinations of substances for dermal or mucous membrane filling use, etc. This will now be also under the scope of medical device regulations. So after having reviewed this definition, what would you say? Is there any difference between these two armchairs? Could any of these two armchairs become CE certified as medical device? The answer, even though this is a very extreme example and just for the purpose of this webinar, basically, armchair, which is basic, simple furniture, of course, cannot be considered medical device, but to some extent, if we could demonstrate that this armchair with identical design to this other furniture armchair effectively relieves back pain, could be considered for CE certification as medical device. Of course, this is just for fun, but it illustrates the concept behind the medical device definition. It does not depend on the device, on its design, but on the claims that the manufacturers put on that device, the claims that the manufacturers attributes to the device, and what can actually become demonstrated. If we look at the definition for in vitro diagnostic medical device, again, it can be anything, including reagents, calibrators, control materials, specimen receptacles, related instruments, software-related articles, related apparatus, or anything else that is used for the examination, again, of human specimens, so cannot be used on animals, and provide information for any of these uses. Diagnosis, aid to diagnosis, which is not exactly the same as diagnosis, and screening, monitoring, predisposition, prediction, or determination. So when we talk of in vitro diagnostics, we need to become aware that the intended purpose, of course, is of diagnostic intention, but diagnosis can have many subtleties, and we need to specify what is actually the IVD intended for. Screening, for instance, is providing a risk score for some clinical condition, whereas diagnosis should allow to define what is the clinical status of a patient and not link the outcome with a risk factor. So there are some subtleties in each of these different intended purpose, and this has, of course, clinical implications. So it's important that from a wording perspective, each term is used correctly. The definition of IVD, as you can find it in the regulation, is that one, but basically we just reviewed what it means, because the image can be probably more useful for understanding what it means. But yeah, you can find it. The different coloring, by the way, it's the differences in terms of medical device and IVD definitions of the new regulations as compared to the definitions that we had up to now in the corresponding directives. That is why some text is highlighted in a different color. So let's review classification concepts for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. Medical devices will be classified in Europe in 4 different risk classes: 1, 2A, 2B, and 3, depending on the risk. So that class 1 is the least risk, class 2A and 2B are moderate risk classes, and class 3 is the highest risk class. For IVDs, we also have 4 risk classes, but they are named differently: class A, B, C, and D. Again, from less to more risk. These 2 classification systems, well, the one for medical, for in vitro diagnostics in particular, is completely new. We just commented that. It's one of the challenges of the new regulation for in vitro diagnostics, that the classification system is completely changed, and that is one of the big challenges for the IVD industry. For medical devices, we already had 4 classification classes, 4 risk classes, but classification rules have become enlarged. We have 22 classification rules under the regulation, whereby we have 18 classification rules for medical devices in the corresponding directive. This means that we have now more rules that better reflect the technological progress, that brings the regulation in pace with technological progress, because the medical device directive was outdated in this sense. We have now one specific classification rule for software, for instance, or one specific classification rule for nanomaterials or nano components in medical devices, etc. On the other hand, some rules that were already existing under the medical device directive have now additional senses. So globally speaking, we have a much more complex classification system, but it has not dramatically changed, like in the case of the IVD classification system. Because we have different technological types of medical devices, including, for instance, active implantable devices or active non-implantable devices, the so-called substance-based devices. We also have surgical equipment or instrumentation, the so-called soft tissue devices, wound care devices, drug delivery devices, vascular, endovascular devices, orthopedic and dental devices, etc. We need to understand how are the classification rules actually applied. So therefore, we need to review some classification concepts. On one hand, we need to understand what is the duration of use of each medical device. So we will define devices in terms of their duration of use as either transient, short-term, or long-term devices, where transient devices will be continuously used for less than 60 minutes. They will be categorized as short-term devices if they are meant to be continuously used for more than 60 minutes, but for less than 30 days. And for the long-term devices, also referred as implantable devices, a continuous use is expected for more than 30 days. Then another parameter is the invasiveness. We will find invasive devices if they are in whole or in part introduced into the body, either through the surface of the body or by a natural orifice. Therefore, if we need to make an incision to introduce a device, we call it surgically invasive. Okay, and if we leave the device inside the body for a permanent period of time, then we have implantable devices. And another parameter is whether the device depends or not on an outer source of energy, which can be electricity or any other kind of energy, not necessarily only electricity. Okay, it can be mechanical energy, chemical energy, like for instance, pressurized devices are considered to be active because they might be actuated by propelling gas, and that is not a device that contains batteries, for instance, but this active concept means that the device needs some kind of outer source of energy to act, basically. So these are the main classification concepts, and let's now review what is the IVD classification system under the new regulation and how it has changed from the past IVD directive classification system. Well, basically, we had two lists, A and B, under Annex 2 of the IVD directive that were listing a finite list of devices that could be considered of high risk. That was not necessarily in accordance with the current situation where the progress in terms of molecular biology has allowed to put many IVD kits and systems on the market that are meant to be used for instance, cancer diagnosis or cancer screening and other potential clinical uses that have, of course, a high risk for the individual. That required that the whole classification system becomes reviewed, and the regulation will set 7 classification rules that allow to really classify IVDs that can be of many different technological types, like you can see on this slide, but that by virtue of their clinical intended purpose have a considerable risk and that will now be more appropriately classified. So IVDs can be, technologically speaking, very different. They might be used for near-patient testing, the so-called point-of-care devices. They can be based on microarray technique. They can be based on microfluidics. They can be based on immunoassays, might be including a tumor marker, or might be aimed for tissue typing, for genetic testing. So the IVDs are very broad in terms of technological underlying principle, and also, of course, like for medical devices, in terms of their intended purpose. So complexity is important. And the classification concepts here are whether or not the outcome of the IVD consists or poses a personal risk or a public health risk. And in terms of personal and public health risk, will the IVDs become classified in either class A, B, C, or D? You can see here on this slide some examples just for you to have an idea. And so we could say that class A for IVDs corresponds to class 1 medical devices, class B corresponds to class 2A for medical devices, and class C to class 2B, and finally class D in IVD classification concepts would correspond to class 3 in medical devices. What manufacturers need to do? So what do manufacturers need to prepare, and what do they need to have in place in order to undertake a CE marking procedure? Basically, two things: the technical documentation pertaining to the device and the quality management system of their organization. These are the two main aspects of the CE marking procedure. Technical documentation will, in principle, entail a dossier that needs to describe everything that pertains to the medical device, including what it is, what it is meant to do, what is the specification of the device in terms of materials of construction, also known as bill of materials. We need to find in this documentation who the manufacturer is in terms of legal entity becoming responsible of the compliance of this device, but also who is eventually producing the whole or parts of this medical device. We need to find the right instructions for use and labels on the device itself, on any packaging level of this device. We need to find information on this device design from the conception of the device until the final commercial prototype, description of the manufacturing process. We need to find a list of the applicable requirements, referred as the General and Safety Performance Requirements Checklist, where it is stated what requirements apply and how is the manufacturer demonstrating compliance to each of these applicable requirements. We need to find information on the risk management pertaining to this device. We need to find summaries of any study conducted to verify the product performance and safety, any validation that is relevant to this device, information on the post-marketing surveillance plan, which is that, well, this acronym means post-market surveillance, and we need to find a signed declaration of conformity, which is a one-page document normally where the manufacturer basically signs and declares that the device is conforming to the legal framework. This is something that is also required. And at the other end, the quality management system of this manufacturer that would need to be based on ISO 13485. Typically, manufacturers will undertake a CE certification or a certification of their QMS based on this ISO. And this certification is also typically undertaken with the same notified body that will CE certify the device, or that will be involved in evaluating the device documentation, but not necessarily. The manufacturer could have the QMS certified with one notified body and undertake the CE certification with another notified body. In any case, the CE certification requires that both aspects become reviewed, because the ultimate idea is that not only the device compliance needs to be demonstrated, but it needs to be ensured that the quality management system in place is adequate to guarantee that any manufacturing run, so that any subsequent industrial batch will continue complying with the device specification, and that will meet everything that is described in the technical documentation. So these are the two main ends of a CE certification procedure. We were just commenting about the General Safety and Performance Requirements Checklist, also referred to as GSPR checklist. It's the cornerstone of the CE certification, at least for the device part. not for the QMS part, but for the device part, you will find the GSPR list, the full list of all potential regulatory requirements under Annex 1 of both regulations. And basically, you need to know that they are grouped into 3 chapters, where Chapter 1 lists the general requirements, Chapter 2 the design and manufacturing requirements, and Chapter 3 the requirements concerning the information to be supplied by the manufacturer. Let's review them in a little bit more detail, even though we could spend hours talking of requirements. This will be a very, very succinct overview. Basically, under general requirements, we find that we need to make sure that the devices are designed and manufactured to guarantee that they are safe and effective. It puts a lot of emphasis on risk management and on risk assessment. And of course, because they are general requirements, they apply in any case. So these are general requirements applying to all medical devices. And manufacturers need to demonstrate that they have really made everything in order to prove that these requirements are met. And whatever the manufacturer did needs to be found in the technical documentation in terms of declarations, certifications, specifications, study reports, etc. Chapter 2 is probably the most crucial chapter for device development because it makes emphasis on device characterization and testing, clinical evaluation, or performance evaluation. Like these are the 2 terms for medical devices and for in vitro diagnostics, respectively, and also to risk assessment plans and reports. Like as an example of what typical reports or studies device characterization and testing can entail are biocompatibility assessments, usability tests, sterilization validation, software validation, and stability testing. But these are just a few of the potential characterization and testing studies that manufacturers need to undertake. But it's quite important that you become familiar with these concepts because they are typical and applicable to many different kinds of devices. And last but not least, Chapter 3 lists the requirements that manufacturers need to be aware of in order to produce instructions for use, which are referred as IFUs for short, and any labeling on the packaging or on the device itself in order to provide the adequate information on the use of the device and of any limitations, contraindications, precautions, or warnings to be taken into account. For your information, there are no QRDs for instructions for use for medical devices. There is no such thing. Therefore, in order to appropriately translate instructions for use, which is a document that very likely can become a work order for you in particular, you cannot refer to QRDs, and from a terminology point of view, some concepts are clearly different from medicinal products SMPCs, so that's why it's important to become familiar with these concepts. And luckily, we don't have QRDs, so it's about reading a lot on medical devices and having probably examples on instructions for use in order to have this knowledge on the right terminology. One of the milestones before CE marking, like we said, is compiling the technical documentation. The expectations in terms of CE certification under the 2 regulations are listed under Annex 2 of both legal texts, and as we just reviewed, need to entail information on all these elements. So we will expect to find modules or sections with information on these aspects, and any of these modules or sections is basically susceptible of require at some point a translation, but most probably of test reports that might be either found under the device testing data or module or clinical evaluation studies, and as we said, instructions for use and labeling. These are most probably the sections and modules where manufacturers might need translations. So requirements might be applicable, and manufacturers need to demonstrate compliance. Manufacturers can choose to either set new methods of their own to demonstrate such compliance, but most typically they refer to technical standards, which are these, for instance, ISO standards or standards published by other standards publishing organizations like ASTM, CLSI for IVDs, or the European Committee for Standardization. And it's very interesting to identify if standards are harmonized, which in European terms means that the European Commission publishes that these and that standard can be considered to presume conformity to particular requirements where they are followed or applied. That is why it's important to identify harmonized standards in each case. We don't have harmonized standards for everything or for every kind of medical device, and where we don't have harmonized standards, we need to find non-harmonized standards, which is normally better than setting up our own methods, because standards at the end of the day are considered to be methods commonly and generally accepted by the particular industrial sector. Another interesting source of documentation for demonstrating compliance are the guidelines, which, as we saw, in Europe can be published by the European Commission, by this international organism, the IVDRF, that has included the GHDF organism, FDA, or the WHO. The MedDev guidelines currently were published before the publication date of the two regulations, and it is expected that they will become updated to meet regulations requirements at some point in the coming months and years. But so far, we have the MedDevs published before 2017 and are still used by the manufacturers. Let's switch to medical device regulations in the United States. I hope we have some time at the end to answer to some questions that you might have. But let's now move on in order to have time to review everything. So in the United States, the legal authority for the commercialization of medical devices is the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA for short. Basically, within FDA, the two organisms that will have to deal with devices at some point will be the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CVRH for short, or the Office of In Vitro Diagnostic and Radiological Health, OER for short, for in vitro diagnostics. The legal framework in the United States is given by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and by the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, which is normally referred to as 21 CFR, and then the specific part of it. For medical devices, we will look at parts 800 to 1299. This is what the equivalent information to CE marking and directives and regulations transitional period in Europe. The classification of medical devices in the US is first based on risk, and as we will see in a moment, also based on their technological basis and clinical scope. So based on risk, we have 3 risk classes, not 4 like in Europe, but 3, only 3 risk classes, classes 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so as you can see here, class 2 in the United States will not be split into 2A and 2B, we only have class 2. But again, class 1 is the least risk class, and class 3 is the highest risk class, whereby class 3 medical devices are assumed to be those that either support or sustain human life, which are of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, or which present a potential unreasonable risk of illness or injury. So this is the definition of a class 3 medical device according to FDA regulations for medical devices. But if we look at classification of medical devices in the US, we see that we also need to take the technical scope and the clinical use into account. There are several databases in the FDA, and in particular, we want to take a closer look at the product classification database, where we see that devices will become classified into different medical specialties, in particular 16 medical specialties. So we need to try to define what is the most right or the most applicable medical specialty to our medical device when we intend to classify it for commercialization in the United States. It's not always easy because some or different medical specialties could apply to the same medical device. So classifying a medical device based on the technical and scope and clinical use in following the product classification database of FDA is not always an easy task. And we need to be able to find sub-classification panels within each of these 16 different medical specialties. And we need to be able to identify an ultimate 3-digit code for each device, which will be the final classification of a given medical device. Okay, so we will finally end up having a 3-letter code in terms of device classification in the FDA. Depending on the risk class, we will have 3 different FDA registration procedures. We can have the most easy registration procedure is the one that is mostly applicable to Class 1 devices or Class 2 devices, which are exempt of FDA review. So here, exempt means exempt of FDA review, where the FDA does not review any technical data of the medical device. That is why this is the less stringent registration procedure, the easiest one. It does not require any pre-market submission. FDA does not review technical data. Only general controls are applicable, and we will see on the next slide what general controls mean. So this is the most straightforward registration way, mostly applicable to Class 1 devices, typically exempt of this FDA review, and eventually also applicable to some Class 2 devices that are exempt. In principle, Class 2 devices will most typically be expected to undergo a pre-market notification procedure where FDA reviews some technical aspects. So Class 2 devices or Class 1 devices that are non-exempt of this FDA review need to undertake the so-called 510K procedure, where we need to demonstrate that we comply with some general controls, like for Class 1 exempt devices, but also to special controls. And we will see in a moment what special controls mean. The aim of this 510K procedure is that the manufacturer is demonstrating substantial equivalence of that device compared to one or more predicate devices. And predicate devices need to be devices already cleared by FDA, commercialized in the United States, and to which our device shares similarities. This is the so-called abridged application applicable to Class 2 devices or Class 1 devices that are non-exempt. The most difficult, lengthy, burdensome, and expensive procedure is the PMA or pre-market approval procedure, where FDA reviews everything. It's a full application. The aim is no longer to demonstrate substantial equivalence to a predicate device, because our device is Class 3. So of the highest risk class, and we need to demonstrate everything, performance and safety. Applicable controls are general controls because they apply in all cases, but special controls are no longer applicable. We need to provide full data on performance and safety of our device. There is an exception to this rule because in principle, of course, we cannot directly apply the 510K abridged procedure for devices that have no predicate on the market because they are new. So we could have new medical devices that have no potential predicate because they are new. They have either new technological features or new clinical applications, and therefore we cannot find a suitable predicate. Automatically, devices that have no predicate will be considered class 3. But when these devices, even though they are new, when these devices do not pose any of these safety concerns that where the definition of class 3, where these devices, even though they are new, do not support or sustain human life, or are not of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, etc., or we can argue that they do not pose any potential or unreasonable risk of illness or injury, then we can apply for de novo down classification of this device into class 2, where we will follow an abridged application without any predicate device. So we will not argue any substantial equivalence because there is no predicate device, but we will allow to follow an abridged application because our device was successful in this de novo down classification. So this is about FDA procedures. And now let's shortly review the FDA requirements. We were commenting that we have 3 different levels of controls. We have general controls, which are applicable to all medical device classes. That entails establishment registration, so manufacturers, sterilizers, repackagers, refurbishers, anyone that has some role or intervenes in producing in whole or in part the medical device, including the legal entity that is responsible of this medical device, needs to be registered with FDA and pay the corresponding fee. The device itself needs to be registered. This is known as device listing. And then there are some general labeling requirements, so that the labeling and the instructions for use need to comply with general FDA controls and guidances. And then devices in the United States should be manufactured in accordance to the so-called current good manufacturing practices or these quality system regulations that we mentioned before. This is the ISO 13485. It's not directly accepted by FDA, but there's a project ongoing whereby FDA will include ISO 13485 as CGMP compliance standard, so that in the near future it will be sufficient that devices are manufactured under ISO 13485 also in the United States. Special controls include performance standards and FDA guidelines. They also include post-market surveillance, patient registries, special labeling requirements, and pre-market notification as a procedure. So they are in principle applicable to class 2 medical devices, and they are typically device specific. In order to identify the right special controls, it is important that we find the right medical specialty panel, the subspecialty panel, and the final 3-letter code. And it's in under this 3-letter code that we will be able to identify the applicable performance standards and referred FDA guidelines, the so-called special controls. The most stringent control, as we said, is the pre-market approval, which is applicable in principle to class 3 medical devices, unless we can attempt to down classify our device, our novel device, by the de novo procedure. And PMA will typically require that we provide full evaluation of device safety and performance, and that will typically include technical data as well as preclinical and clinical studies and investigations in full compliance with good laboratory practices and good clinical practices. So basically the PMA procedure is very stringent and very demanding, and is also subject to the most expensive fee. So that is everything that we had for today's webinar. It took us 1 hour, but we have some additional time in case you have some questions, or in case you would like us to clarify anything in more detail. Oh, let me. Okay. I am seeing that there are some questions, but I need to. Sorry, I'm not seeing the questions, but I know there are some questions.
We can use chat too. Maybe we can use the chat
Yes,
or
maybe.
the communication.
Maybe it's easier if you use a chat to send me your questions, because I cannot see them on my display. Barbara has some questions, I think. But I need to. Okay, now I see. Sorry. So one question is, I understand from Annex 2 of the MDR that labeling and from labeling. Sorry, there is some problem with the display. I cannot read the full question. We will try to find our IT department for support. If you are so kind to wait 1 minute, I think we'll be able to review everything and provide you an answer. Just hold on a minute, please. Sorry, the IT service, the IT department has not yet arrived. I would kindly ask you to speak out your questions, because we can read part of them, but not all of them. We can read that one question is that you would like to understand translation requirements for labeling and issues, but we cannot read the full question. So if you can speak out and express your question, we might save time.
Tienes que desmutarlos, creo. Attendees.
Okay. Oh, you are muted because okay. I am unmuting everyone. So you can
Thank you.
speak out your questions. I apologize because that platform, I have never used this platform for webinars before.
No problem. It worked well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was my question you started with, so perhaps I'll finish that one.
You are speaking, but I can still not hear you, so we really need to wait for the IT department, because I am seeing Craig Brown talking, but I cannot hear anyone. I'm really sorry. If you can still hold on for a couple of minutes, I hope we will be able to have some support.
Can you hear anyone else? No.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Maybe
Just
we've
talk
muted
amongst
her.
ourselves. Maybe.
Very good quality, isn't it, the sound?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's try now. I think we could solve something internally. Who wants to start with a question?
Can you hear us? No? Hello?
Hello?
Hi. Okay, well, perhaps I'll just finish the one you started. So I understand from Annex 2 of the MDR that labeling and IFUs are to be translated into the languages of the countries in which the medical device is marketed. Are they the only parts of the technical dossier that have to be translated? Or does the full technical dossier ever have to be translated?
No. Okay, so this is a good question. Is it Craig?
Yes, hi.
Craig. Well, okay, this is a good an interesting question. That, from our experience, depends mostly of to, well, basically depends on the notified body and of the competent authority, because both might become involved in the CE certification. For devices of risk class higher than 1, the notified body will be involved in the CE certification. Okay, so only class 1 devices that are not sterile or have no measuring function or that need to be reused, only those really simple devices will be CE marked on the sole responsibility of the manufacturer, and therefore if-use and labeling need to be, of course, in the languages of each member state where they will be commercialized, but technical documentation, no one will review it, okay? But for medical devices of risk classes higher than 1, or class 1 devices that are either sterile, have a measuring function, or need to be reused, or are aimed to be reused, the notified body will become involved in the CE certification, okay? And the technical documentation or part of it will be reviewed by the notified body. In this case, depending on the part of the technical documentation that needs to be reviewed, of course, the documentation should be in a language that the notified body is able to understand.
Right.
And
So
this
I
is
see.
not, and this is not always the same for all notified bodies. For instance, the Spanish notified body, the public notified body that depends of the Spanish agency for medical devices and medicinal products, has specific requirements, and is more and more keen on accepting technical documentation in English, but
Right.
will not necessarily be able to follow explanations in Polish or in Italian or in French or in German. So the general rule is that technical documentation is either in English or partly in English, and some sections or some modules might be in the local language. Depending on how critical these other sections in the local language are for review by a notified body, then these sections should be translated. Some typical sections will be either clinical evaluation reports and any reports including testing of relevant aspects of the medical device, so biocompatibility reports, sterilization validation reports, including the protocols and reports of anything, including biocompatibility, sterility, usability,
Right.
This testing needs to be in a language that the notified body can understand.
So is the language of the notified body something that you would take into account when selecting a notified body, or is that a secondary issue?
No, it's important. You need
Right.
to make sure that the notified body will be able to understand your documentation. But typically, technical documentation in English should not be a problem. So it's important to make sure that other languages other than English will also be acceptable by notified bodies. But I think it's something that needs to be confirmed in any case, because there are, for instance, we were talking of Polish. There are Polish notified bodies that eventually have some specific requirements in terms of language, and or manufacturers might have contracted and selected providers, CROs, to perform studies that are based wherever, and they do not necessarily provide the reports in English or in a language that the notified body is able to understand. Typically, English should be acceptable, but not always manufacturers perform their studies in that language, and therefore translations might be required. Another the quality management system. The procedures of the quality management system typically are written, of course, in the language of the country where the manufacturer is based, because these procedures need to be understood by the technical staff.
Right.
And this is typically written in the local language, because the notified body will need to review some of these procedures as well. Eventually, some of these procedures should also be translated. So not only technical documentation of the device needs to be translated, but eventually also quality management system procedures.
Got it. Thank you.
My question is slightly related, so I wonder if I could ask it now. I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about the role of the notified body and the competent authority and what the difference is between the two.
Yes, okay, yes, good question. Again, good question.
Thank you.
So the notified body is this third party that is accredited to review technical documentation and QMS procedures in order to see in how far the device is compliant with the requirements and in how far the QMS is adequate to guarantee compliance with the requirements in any production run.
Mhm.
This is their role. Where devices include substances, for instance, that have pharmacological action, which is secondary or auxiliary to the device itself, like could be the case of, for instance, stents. Okay, let's imagine a stent, cardiovascular stent that is coated. This is a typical example that is coated with some cytotoxic drug or antithrombotic drug. This is quite typical. In this case, the stent is a medical device because it's opening the vase. It's really having a mechanical action. It falls under the definition of medical device, but auxiliarily, secondarily to this first intended purpose of the stent, the drug coating is ensuring that there will be no thrombus generation into this in the inner lumen of the vein, and this is an acceptable secondary action for a pharmacological substance included in the device composition. And where this happens, a specific classification rule applies. In particular, Rule 13 of the directive, or now Rule 14 under the regulation. And this brings that a competent authority needs to be involved in the CE certification of the medical device, whereby the specific quality, safety, and efficacy aspects of the drug, of this auxiliary drug in the medical device, need to be reviewed. So in particular cases for drug device combinations, a competent authority of medicinal products becomes involved in the CE certification, whereby this competent authority needs to be consulted. They need to be consulted in order to make sure that quality, safety, and efficacy aspects of the drugs comply with the corresponding requirements applicable to drugs. So the competent authority will review these aspects pertaining to quality, safety, and efficacy of the drug in accordance and by analogy with the principles of the Medicinal Products Directive. So this is why competent authorities sometimes become involved in the CE certification process of complex medical devices. Now, under the new regulation, this is quite complex because the regulation includes other scenarios where additional parts will eventually become involved. Competent authorities for medicinal products will also become involved in CE certification of medical devices, for instance, including substances derived from animal or human tissues that they are not viable, because we know they cannot be viable, but when medical devices include substances of either animal or human origin, again, a competent authority of medicinal products will become consulted. They will need to review the corresponding relevant aspects of these animal or human derived substances, and so they will also become involved in the CE certification. Other parts that will become eventually involved in the CE certification, in addition to notified bodies according to the new regulations, are the so-called expert panels. This is something super new of the regulations. The European Commission has designated experts across Europe, in particular technical fields, and specifically for Class 3 devices and Class 2B implantable devices that will either administer or remove drugs. Okay, so for this kind of devices of high risk, in addition to the notified body, an expert panel will also become involved in the CE certification procedure. they will be requested to scrutinize clinical data. So the whole landscape of CE certification and of relevant parts involved is becoming more complex. For sure, the relevant part remains the notified body as auditing part, and of course the manufacturer as legal and responsible part, but there will be additional parts involved, including either competent authorities for particular cases or the so-called expert panels.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe I can ask at this point. So you mentioned there is no QRD text. I've been looking for some time now whether there's any standard text at all in connection with medical devices. I've never really found anything terribly useful. So there are no national authorities that prescribe any standard text either. Is that your experience?
Yeah, that is what I meant. There are no authorities. What basically the terms do not need to be. So that is good news on one one perspective, because it's nothing is absolutely wrong. So as long as the terms are right, non-confusing, and adequately get translated, it's not that specific like for medicinal products. So the good news is you cannot be 100% wrong, but on the other hand, you have this doubt as to whether the text will be acceptable. And at the end of the day, it's the same thing for Class 1 devices. You need to notify locally in each member state that you are commercializing the device, and for the other risk classes, you will also register the device. At the end of the day, the competent authority eventually will review your text. Before you register the device, at the CE certification stage, the notified body, of course, reviews your IFUS proposal. But for instance, if you CE certify your device in English, your IFUS will be in English. The notified body will say okay to your text or ask for some amendments or corrections. And when you translate that IFU to commercialize the device in a particular member state, you will request permission to the corresponding competent authority by registering the device in that member state. And this normally entails that you upload your proposed IFUs, and normally that entails that you upload the originally certified IFUs, for instance, in English language, and your translation of this IFUs. And the competent authority normally reviews that they agree with not with the translation itself, but with your translated version for commercialization of the device in the particular country. This is a rather non-standardized procedure, because each competent authority will have eventually different criteria. We cannot expect to have the same level of harmonization like for medicinal products. You can expect that competent authorities might eventually challenge something on your translated version of the IFUS or on the limited text that you can find in the labeling. That is not always the case, but that can happen. So you cannot rule out that they will challenge your translation. Of course, everything that could eventually confuse the patient in terms of medical device use, that eventually could infer that the device has performance and safety claims that are not adequately supported by the technical and scientific data, might be critical. So anything that may have some risk for the patient will be more critically reviewed than other parts of the IFUs and of the labeling.
Is there any is there on the similar subject, is there any requirement for the IFUs to be user tested? Because yes, you said that they have to be clear, for the patient. Is that something that happens to the translation after we submit it? Do they user test it, or are your clients expected to user test there?
No, like the usability, no, like the readability test that will be applicable for medical products is not always requested for medical devices, and there is no such thing. We don't refer to it as readability test, but for devices that have some technical feature that needs to be user tested, not always the case. Because, for instance, you would not expect to have any user testing on plasters. Okay, but plaster has an innovative feature that requires it to be user tested in the context of usability testing. By the way, I should have included that scope in the table of compared terminology. In the United States, for your information, the usability testing is known as human factors study or human factors engineering study or testing. They refer to it as human factors engineering. So when the device has some specific aspect that is innovative and that has not or is not well established, it needs to be user tested. And in this context, when you plan a user test, normally you need to see the instructions for use. The instruction for use, you normally need to identify what are the critical steps in the instructions for use for them to be tested in the real population. So in an indirect way, you are confirming readability and that the patient or the user really understands the issues in the right way. Okay, so there is similar thing, but not referred to as readability testing.
Got it. Thank you.
Can I ask one more question also from the point of view of a translation service provider? Would you say it's worth looking into getting ISO certification for medical devices, or is this not really relevant because the I mean, we come from a different angle, from the linguistic angle, and as such we don't need to comply with a medical devices directive, but I know that some of our competitors have ISO certification for medical devices, and I always wondered what the overlap is there between translation and medical devices certification.
I would say I don't really see the need or the point in certifying the company under ISO 13485. I don't really see any you know, I don't think it's relevant at all. Of course, it's important to have appropriate translations, but this would never be considered. You would never be considered as a critical provider, meaning the notified body will never audit or appear from this point of view. Whereas sterilization providers and any third party that is subcontracted by the manufacturer for releasing whether the whole or part of the medical device might be subject to notified body audit, but a translator company would never be audited by notified body. So in that sense, I don't really see the point. No.
Yeah, thank you. Good to know.
Yeah.
Maybe if there are some competent that has some type of ISO, it's something commercial that could be nice at the first moment, but the applicability is not necessary.
No. The company might have undertaken procedure just for distinguishing somehow, but we don't see the need.
Interesting.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, I think we're good here in the office.
Thank you very much indeed.
It's our pleasure, by the way. If anyone thinks of a question later on, of course, you're more than welcome to send them by email, don't worry. And we will be happy to clarify it. So don't worry if you don't think of any other questions right now. If there is anything important to be clarified either before or during your Congress in San Diego, we'll make our best to try to provide an answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.